Some of the most horrifying execution methods in history didn't just kill their victims in minutes, they killed them slowly, painfully, and often for days. These brutal punishments were so inhumane that, in the end, even the most bloodthirsty medieval rulers had to admit, this is too much. These methods were designed to terrorize, to send a clear message that certain crimes would never be tolerated. In this video, we're diving deep into 20 execution techniques so cruel that they were eventually banned for being too gruesome. From gruesome tortures to public spectacles that aim to terrorize entire populations, we're counting down the most horrifying ways that human beings were made to pay for their crimes. And just when you think you've heard it all, number 1 will make every horror movie you've seen look like a walk in the park. So sit tight, because this countdown will shock you, disturb you, and make you rethink the very concept of punishment. Let's start with number 20, lingqi. Lingqi, better known as death by 1,000 cuts, was an execution method so horrific that it lingered in the annals of Chinese law for nearly 900 years. Originating in the Tang dynasty, it wasn't just reserved for any crime. No, only the most heinous of acts could warrant such a punishment: treason, patricide, or rebellion against the state. This prolonged death sentence wasn't intended to be quick. It was meant to be a slow, agonizing process. The victim would be tied down, and each cut would pierce their flesh, a painful procedure that could take hours or even days to result in death. It was both a method of torture and an execution, and its gruesome nature was meant to serve as a chilling warning to others. The exact number of cuts varied, but it was said that the term 1,000 was more symbolic than literal. Stories of victims being cut 1,000 times were often exaggerated, with actual counts being much lower. Nonetheless, the cruelty of the method left an indelible mark on history. Even when the Qing dynasty finally abolished it in 1905, the legacy of lingqi continued to haunt the collective memory of the people. If the state could decide that even this punishment was too much, what did that say about the limits of human cruelty? Here comes number 19, England's hanged. The phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered has become synonymous with one of the most brutal and terrifying punishments in history. Originating in medieval England, this method was used as a sentence for treason. The condemned would be hanged by the neck, drawn, meaning they would be dragged through the streets before being disemboweled and then beheaded. But that wasn't the end. The victim would then be dismembered, with their body cut into 4 parts and displayed in different parts of the city. The public spectacle was designed to make a statement. Treason was the ultimate crime, and the consequences would be unimaginably severe. For centuries, the phrase was used in legal records, but as time wore on, the act itself became less and less common. By the 1600s, it was considered too barbaric to carry out, and by 1870, the law was finally abolished. Despite this, the mere threat of the punishment continued to hang over the heads of criminals for years. This odd paradox, where the language remained but the act itself faded, sheds light on the power of symbolism in punishment and justice. Let's move to number 18, burning at the stake. One of the most iconic and terrifying punishments in medieval Europe was burning at the stake. This was often reserved for those convicted of heresy, and it was intended to not only kill the condemned, but to act as a public cleansing. In 1553, during the reign of Queen Mary I of England, nearly 300 Protestants were burned alive for refusing to accept Catholicism. The flames were meant to purify the soul of the heretic and send a message that the state would not tolerate religious dissent. But the cruelty didn't end with the fire. The entire process was designed to be drawn out and excruciating. The flames would often burn the victims slowly, leaving them to suffer for a prolonged period. Even in the 18th century, burning at the stake was still used in England, with the last known case being that of Catherine Murphy in 1789 for petty treason. By then, society had largely moved on, and the practice fell into disrepute. The final days of burning at the stake came quietly, with little fanfare or celebration. It was as though society had grown too embarrassed by the spectacle to continue with it, yet the scars of the practice remained in history's collective memory for centuries. Here comes number 17. Breaking on the wheel. Breaking on the wheel sounds like something out of a medieval fairy tale, but in reality, it was a well-known punishment that lasted into the 1800s. Used in several European countries, including France, Germany, and Prussia, this punishment was used for crimes like murder and robbery. The condemned would be tied to a large wheel and have their limbs broken before being left to die. The wheel itself was a symbol of the victim's fate, the breaking of their body, and the public display of their suffering. But the cruelty didn't stop there. In some cases, the body would be left on the wheel as a public spectacle meant to terrorize the public into obedience. The method lasted for centuries, with Prussia's last recorded use being in 1841, well into the modern era, during a time of industrialization and social change. The persistence of such a brutal method into the 19th century reveals a chilling truth. Sometimes, even in an era of progress, old and cruel customs can hold on far longer than they should. Next one is number 16. Boiling to death. Boiling to death is as horrifying as it sounds. In 1531, King Henry VIII of England declared that anyone found guilty of poisoning would be punished by being boiled alive. The law was intended to send a stark message. Poisoners were to be feared, and their crimes could not go unpunished. The first victim to suffer this grisly fate was Richard Roos in 1532, a man convicted of poisoning a batch of porridge. But the gruesome punishment didn't last long. By 1547, just 16 years after the law had been enacted, King Edward VI repealed the law, realizing that such a horrifying spectacle was not something the people could stomach. The idea of boiling someone alive was so barbaric that even in a time known for its public executions, it was deemed too much to bear. This case highlights an interesting paradox in the history of capital punishment. Laws and practices can sometimes be born out of a desire to send a message, but when the spectacle itself becomes more horrific than the crime, even the harshest governments may reconsider. Here comes number 15. Impalement. Impalement is one of the most graphic and terrifying forms of execution ever used in history. Popularized by Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler, in the 1400s, this gruesome punishment involved inserting a sharp stake through the body, often starting from the rectum or genital area, and driving it out through the mouth or the chest. The process was painfully slow, and victims would sometimes be left to die on the stake, hanging by their own bodies for hours or even days. The psychological terror it inspired was immense, especially since impalement wasn't just a punishment. It was meant to send a message. Vlad used this technique to instill fear among his enemies, reportedly impaling tens of thousands of people as a way to assert his dominance and control over his subjects. The impact of impalement, both real and imagined, lasted long after Vlad's time. His name became synonymous with cruelty, and the act of impalement became an enduring symbol of terror, used by future generations to illustrate the power of fear. Let's move to number 14. Execution by elephant. Execution by elephant is one of those punishments that sound mythical, but it was very real in India, South and Southeast Asia. This practice was particularly common in ancient India, where elephants were used not just as a means of transportation or war, but also as instruments of justice. The method itself was both brutal and symbolic. Depending on the ruler's wishes, the elephant might kill the victim quickly or torment them slowly by trampling them. Elephants were also used in public executions to show the ruler's dominion over nature, turning the punishment into a display of absolute control. One of the most chilling aspects of this method was that the victim's death was often prolonged for the entertainment of the crowd. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European travelers wrote about watching these executions, fascinated by the spectacle. But when colonial powers arrived in Asia, they eventually outlawed this form of punishment, with the last recorded use in the 19th century. Despite its abolition, the memory of execution by elephant lingers as a reminder of the sheer spectacle and cruelty of ancient punishments. Next one is number 13. The brazen bull. The brazen bull is one of the most iconic and terrifying forms of execution in ancient Greece. Said to have been invented by Perillos of Athens around the 6th century BCE, this device was a hollow bronze bull that was designed to cook victims alive. The condemned would be locked inside the bull, and a fire would be set underneath it, roasting them to death. The real horror, however, lay in the way the bull was designed. The screams of the victim would supposedly be transformed into the sound of mooing, making the process both horrific and eerily animalistic. It is said that the first victim of the bull was its inventor, Perillos himself, who had made the mistake of suggesting the device to the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily. But was it real? Historians are skeptical that it was ever used, suggesting that the stories of the bull were likely exaggerated or used to illustrate the cruelty of tyrants. Nevertheless, the image of the brazen bull has become an enduring symbol of ancient cruelty, passed down through generations as a warning of what happens when power is unchecked. Let's move to number 12. Scaphism. Scaphism, also known as the boats, was one of the most agonizing and grotesque forms of execution ever recorded. Described by the Greek historian Plutarch, Scaphism involved trapping the victim between two boats, force-feeding them milk and honey, and then leaving them to be eaten alive by insects. The idea was to make the victim suffer over an extended period, allowing the elements and the insects to consume them slowly. The victim's body would rot as they were left exposed to the sun, all the while helpless and suffering. While some historians question whether Scaphism was a real, common punishment or just an exaggerated story, the sheer horror of the concept is undeniable. The idea of a slow, torturous death at the hands of nature itself remains one of the most disturbing punishments in history, leaving behind an enduring legacy of fear. Whether it was fact or fiction, the legacy of Scaphism has lived on as a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Here comes number 11. Keelhauling. Keelhauling, a punishment originating from the Dutch Navy in the 16th century, was as brutal as it sounds. The condemned sailor was tied to a rope and dragged beneath the ship's hull, scraping against barnacles, wood, and iron. The wounds inflicted during this process were typically so severe that survival was extremely rare. The method was meant to serve as both a physical punishment and a reminder of the harsh discipline aboard naval ships. This terrifying form of punishment lasted for nearly 300 years, finally being abolished in 1853. Why did it persist for so long? The answer lies in the remoteness of the seas and the isolated, authoritarian nature of naval life. Keelhauling served as an unforgettable deterrent, ensuring that sailors obeyed orders without question. Even in the 19th century, a time of growing human rights and reforms, this gruesome practice had yet to be fully phased out. The persistence of such brutal punishments, especially in a modernizing world, underscores the tenacity with which some methods of control can endure, even when the values of society have evolved. Keelhauling is a stark reminder that sometimes the tools of coercion last far longer than any real sense of justice. Let's move to number 10, the garrote. The garrote, or garrote vil in Spain, was a terrifying and shockingly recent method of execution. It became the primary method of execution in Spain during the early 19th century, replacing hanging and other more public forms of execution. The garrote involved the condemned being placed in a chair with a collar around their neck, which was then tightened by a screw, strangling them to death. The process was swift but gruesomely efficient, often resulting in a quick and silent death. But what's most disturbing about the garrote is that it remained in use as late as 1974, when Salvador Puig Antich was executed. The relatively modern era in which the garrote was used is jarring. Just 49 years ago, a man was killed by this method. Spain didn't officially abolish the death penalty until 1995, long after most other European countries had moved away from such practices. The garrote's lingering presence in Spain's legal system represents how deeply ingrained and resistant to change some brutal punishments can be. The garrote wasn't just a method of execution. It symbolized the state's control over life and death, its ability to impose finality and authority with cold efficiency. The chilling fact that it was used well into the 20th century suggests that some societies continue to cling to their darkest traditions long after they should have been consigned to history. Next one is number 9. Flaying alive. Flaying alive was one of the most shocking and gruesome forms of execution ever recorded, particularly used by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The practice involved removing the skin of the victim while they were still alive, sometimes in public as a warning to others. The gruesome images of skinning victims were carved into the walls of Assyrian palaces, meant to impress upon foreign visitors the might of the empire. It was a form of psychological warfare as much as physical punishment. The dismembered skin was often displayed publicly, nailed to the gates of cities to spread fear. This public form of punishment made it clear that the Assyrian Empire's power was absolute, and that defying the empire would result in unimaginable suffering. Even after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, the legacy of flaying lingered in the collective memory of surrounding cultures, a horrifying reminder of what could happen if one crossed the wrong ruler. Though no known empire continued this practice as an official form of punishment, the image of flaying lived on in stories and myths, becoming a chilling symbol of tyranny. It's a punishment that, even in the present day, shocks the imagination and serves as a reminder of the unimaginable cruelty humanity has been capable of. Let's move to number 8. Death by sawing. Death by sawing was a horrific punishment recorded in both Roman legal traditions and more recent historical accounts, though it was rare. This gruesome method involved the condemned person being sawed in half, often while they were still alive. The most notorious case of this gruesome punishment came from Morocco in the 1700s, where a governor named Malek was reportedly sawed to death. Though the full extent of its use remains unclear, the image of a person being sawed in half was terrifying enough to become a part of legal lore. The method was so extreme and shocking that it was rarely carried out, and even when it was threatened, the mere possibility of such an execution was often enough to deter the accused from further rebellion. Death by sawing may have been a rare punishment, but its psychological impact was profound. The horror of such an execution method was as much about its rarity as it was about the brutality of the act itself. Its inclusion in Roman law, early Christian martyr tales, and even medieval justice systems speaks to the use of extreme violence as a tool of control and intimidation. Here comes number 7. Crushing by weights. Crushing by weights was a chilling form of punishment used in medieval England, particularly in the practice known as peine forte et dure. The method was used when someone refused to plead in court, often during trials for serious crimes. The condemned person would be placed on the ground, and heavy stones, sometimes as much as 350 to 400 pounds, would be placed on their chest, pressing down until they either gave a confession or died. The punishment was meant to force the accused to speak, but it was rarely about finding the truth. Instead, it was about coercing the individual into submitting to the will of the court. One of the most infamous cases was that of Giles Corey, who was pressed to death during the Salem witch trials in 1692. Corey never gave in to the pressure, and his defiance became a symbol of resistance. The practice was abolished in 1772 in England, a reflection of the growing distaste for such cruel methods of judicial procedure. What's particularly haunting about this punishment is the fact that it wasn't designed to reveal guilt or innocence. It was a tool to ensure compliance with the legal system, no matter the cost. It's a grim reminder of how societies can prioritize their systems over human lives. Next is number 6, stoning. Stoning is one of the oldest and most brutal methods of execution, with roots stretching back to ancient times. It was especially common in Israel and Palestine, where it was used for crimes such as blasphemy, adultery, and idolatry. The condemned person would be thrown from a height, and then stones would be hurled at them by the crowd until they were dead. The method was deliberate, with specific rituals governing how the process was carried out. Stoning wasn't just a punishment, it was a communal act that involved the crowd in the execution. This shared responsibility made it seem less like a violent act and more like a collective social obligation. The tradition spread across the ancient world and, tragically, persists in some countries today. While stoning has been outlawed in most parts of the world, some nations continue to employ it for certain crimes, despite widespread international condemnation. The enduring legacy of stoning speaks to a troubling aspect of human nature. When violence becomes normalized and is carried out by the masses, it becomes more difficult to question or stop. The process becomes as much about maintaining power and control as it is about punishment, a terrifying reminder of the dangers of collective brutality. Let's move to number 5, Rome's penalty of the sack. In ancient Rome, a particularly unusual punishment was reserved for the most heinous of criminals: parricide, or the murder of one's own parent. This punishment, called poena culae, involved sewing the accused into a leather sack along with live animals: a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. The condemned person would then be thrown into water, where they would drown. But the animals' inclusion added a further layer of horror to the act. The specific animals were chosen for their symbolic significance: the dog representing shame, the rooster symbolizing a lack of manhood, the monkey representing dishonor, and the snake symbolizing deceit. This punishment was rarely used but persisted in Roman law, with the last recorded instance taking place in 1761. The severity of this punishment underscores the gravity with which the Romans viewed parricide, one of the most abominable crimes in their legal code. It's a fascinating and disturbing example of how justice systems can evolve to become more or less cruel over time, and how certain punishments can be defined not just by their physical impact, but by the symbolism behind them. Here comes number 4, Immurement. Immurement, the practice of being walled up alive, was one of the most disturbing and bizarre forms of execution throughout history. The process involved sealing a person in a confined space, often a small chamber, where they were left to die from starvation, dehydration, or suffocation. One of the most infamous instances of immurement was the case of the Vestal Virgin, who, if found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity, would be locked in a small cell with only enough food to keep her alive for a short while before death inevitably claimed her. Persia used a similar form of punishment for thieves and rebels, leaving only the head exposed as a grim public warning. Even into the 20th century, some regions continued to employ immurement as a punishment for certain crimes. The idea of being sealed away in a tiny, dark space, left to slowly perish, is a particularly psychological form of torture, as the victim's fate is drawn out over days or even weeks. The practice gradually faded, but its legacy remains a haunting reminder of the human capacity for cruelty, particularly in the name of punishment and control. Next one is number 3, Dismemberment by horses. Dismemberment by horses was a particularly gruesome punishment that was reserved for the most serious of crimes, particularly regicide or treason in France. The condemned person was tied to 4 horses, each one attached to a limb. When the horses were spurred into action, they would tear the person apart, pulling their body in different directions, creating a brutal and often fatal spectacle. The punishment was carried out in front of a public crowd, further adding to the horrific nature of the act. This gruesome display was intended to strike fear into the hearts of the populace and serve as a stark warning to anyone who might consider challenging the king's authority. The final public execution by dismemberment occurred in 1757, when Robert François Damiens attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. His punishment, a brutal and horrifying reminder of the power wielded by the monarchy, marked the end of the dismemberment practice. The move toward more humane methods of execution, including the guillotine, reflected a broader shift in societal attitudes toward justice and punishment. Here comes number 2. Seppuku in Japan. Seppuku, also known as harakiri, is one of the most famous forms of ritual suicide, originating in Japan. While often romanticized in popular culture, the practice was actually an intensely serious and official punishment reserved for samurai who had lost their honor or committed grave offenses. The ritual, meant to restore personal and familial honor, involved the condemned samurai disemboweling themselves with a short sword. The act was considered a way to take responsibility for one's actions and to avoid falling into disgrace. The ritual was highly formalized. It was often done in the presence of witnesses, and the samurai would be required to sit, perform the act, and then, if still alive, would often be decapitated by a second person to bring a swift end to their suffering. Although initially voluntary, by the 15th century, seppuku became an official punishment for samurai who were found guilty of various transgressions. By the time the Meiji government took power in the 19th century, seppuku was formally outlawed as part of the modernization efforts, as Japan began to align more with Western legal systems. However, seppuku didn't fully disappear. It remained part of the cultural and historical consciousness. Even in the 20th century, the ritual was performed for political and personal reasons. The most famous modern case was General Nogi Marasuke, who committed seppuku after Japan's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in 1912. The final act of seppuku in Japan occurred in 1970, when author Yukio Mishima committed the ritual to protest Japan's post-war society. The act of seppuku encapsulates the tension between the ancient traditions of honor and the modern world's view of justice, making it one of the most complicated and enduring legacies of historical punishment. The last one is number 1, crucifixion. Crucifixion is one of the oldest and most infamous execution methods known to humankind. While it was practiced by several ancient civilizations, it was perfected by the Romans as a means of execution for slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state. This method was not only meant to kill, it was designed to be a prolonged and torturous death, meant to serve as both punishment and a public spectacle. Victims were nailed or tied to a cross, with the most common form involving nails through the hands and feet, and left to die from a combination of blood loss, shock, dehydration, and suffocation. Crucifixion could take days, with the victim left hanging in full view, often as a warning to others who might consider defying the state. The message behind crucifixion was clear. It was not just a death sentence, it was a form of humiliation and control. The body of the condemned would often be left on display, sometimes for days, as a stark visual reminder of the consequences of defying Roman authority. The act itself became so brutal and symbolic that the Roman Empire eventually abolished it around the 4th century AD, partly due to its association with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, an event that had profound religious significance. Yet, despite the formal end to crucifixion as a method of execution, its image has endured in religious texts, art, and culture, symbolizing suffering, sacrifice, and power. Today, it serves as a powerful reminder of the extreme lengths to which empires would go to maintain control and the psychological toll that such brutal punishments could have on entire societies. Even as crucifixion faded from use, its legacy continues to haunt humanity's collective memory as one of the most agonizing and unforgettable forms of execution. The shadows of these punishments linger far beyond their last victims. While these methods may seem like ancient history, the terrifying truth is that the desire to control, punish, and deter through violence is a theme that has persisted throughout human history. What's truly chilling is how these punishments, despite being officially banned or abolished, continue to echo through stories, myths, and cultural narratives. They serve as grim reminders of the depths of human cruelty and the extremes to which societies will go in the name of justice, control, and fear. But just because these practices are no longer in use doesn't mean we've escaped the legacy of brutality they left behind. These punishments didn't just disappear, they were replaced, in many ways, by modern methods that, while more humane on the surface, can still be seen as extensions of the same power dynamics that drove the original executions. History has shown us that the need to control others, to instill fear, and to punish severe transgressions is far from a relic of the past. It's a reminder that even in modern society, we should be vigilant about how power is exercised and how justice is applied.